Heavy rains and the threat of more waves complicating tsunami recovery efforts in Indonesia. More than 400 people are now confirmed dead, with teams still searching isolated areas. Another migrant child dies in U.S. Border Control custody. The 8-year-old Guatemalan boy is the second to die in 1 month, raising alarm over America's detention system. And DR Congo delays elections in 3 opposition cities, meaning they won't participate in the presidential vote until March. Our correspondent reports on the reaction. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Charlie James. The death toll continues to rise in Indonesia, where rescue teams are still trying to reach tsunami victims on remote islands. At last count, the country's disaster agency reports 430 people have been killed, with nearly 1,500 others injured. Isolated areas are still desperate for aid following last weekend's volcano-triggered waves. Ruda Abbas takes a look at the ongoing rescue operations.
Picking up the pieces after the trail of destruction, aid begins trickling into isolated communities in the aftermath of a volcano-triggered tsunami. Relief efforts are underway in Indonesia as officials warned the shattered community of the Sunda Strait area of the threat of another tsunami looming. Emergency teams rescued stranded residents from remote islands to disease prevention centres.
We need to help them prevent post-tsunami diseases. Residents evacuated from a tsunami-hit area can likely have illnesses including diarrhea, fever, cough, cold, and skin diseases.
Authorities have asked people to stay at least 500 meters away from the coastline as they monitor weather and sea conditions.
My entire family is traumatized because my house has been destroyed and my boat is also missing. So we are evacuating here for the time being while waiting for the weather to return to normal.
Saturday's eruption of the Anak Krakatoa Island volcano hit communities along the Sunda Strait. On Wednesday, the nation marked the 14th anniversary of the massive magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the Sumatra island, which triggered a tsunami killing 230,000 people in a dozen countries.
There's been seismic activity here in Europe as well. A 4.8 magnitude earthquake hit the area around Italy's Mount Etna early Wednesday. That following the volcano's eruption 2 days prior. The tremors left several people injured and damaged some older buildings. Mount Etna is Europe's most active volcano. An 8-year-old Guatemalan boy died in U.S. government custody the night of Christmas Eve. He is the second migrant child to die in the last month while under the watch of Border Control. Laurent Bescher reports on the reaction so far.
Along the U.S. border with Mexico, just weeks after the death of Jacqueline Kahl, an 8-year-old Guatemalan migrant passed away in U.S. custody on Christmas Day. The young boy was transferred to hospital after showing signs of sickness on Monday, but was released after being diagnosed with a cold. He was rushed back later in the evening and died shortly after midnight. The news triggered a wave of outrage on social media, with the likes of New Mexico Senator Martin Heinrich questioning the administration's responsibility.
Heartbroken and sickened by this news, I am urgently demanding more details, but the Trump administration must be held accountable for this child's death.
The Customs and Border Protection Agency said it would examine all the other children living in the detention center where the boy was held and vowed to launch an independent review to determine the cause of death, the second child fatality in American custody this month. 7-year-old Jacqueline Kahl, who died while being held by U.S. border agents on December 8th, was buried in her home village in Guatemala on Tuesday.
They should respect our rights. People leave because there's no money here.
The Trump administration's efforts to deter undocumented migrants from crossing into the U.S. have been met with widespread criticism, and the government continues to face growing backlash over its treatment of immigrants. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled against a Trump policy restricting asylum applications to designated ports of entry only, The U.S. president also remains locked in a battle with Congress over funding for a planned border wall with Mexico.
Japan is facing international condemnation after confirming it will resume commercial whaling for the first time in more than 30 years. By withdrawing from the International Whaling Commission, the country now joins Iceland and Norway in openly defying the global ban. Japan says it intends to resume commercial hunting in its territorial waters by July next year. Whaling is a centuries-old practice there and is seen as an important cultural tradition by many conservatives. For more on how this decision could affect whale populations, we welcome Mark Simmons to the program. He's a senior marine scientist for Humane Society International. Thank you for being here. Now, Japan's decision has sparked outrage among some of its anti-whaling neighbors. Both Australia and New Zealand are urging Tokyo to reconsider. What could be the impact of resuming the whaling program there?
Yes, it's a really difficult question. I mean, we've seen other protests coming from other countries too. And many people, of course, are off on holiday. But for example, the British Environment Minister has also raised a note of concern about this quite quickly. The implications are, of course, that if Japan retreats to waters near its own coast, it might set a precedent for other countries to also step outside of the Whaling Commission and do the same thing. So the possible implications for whale populations could be quite severe, which is why you're seeing all this protest. The appropriate international body is the International Whaling Commission. It's been there since 1946, and Japan has been a member of the Commission almost all of that time. So this is a very historic and very concerning decision made by Japan.
So, I mean, even though Japan has said it won't hunt in Antarctic waters or the southern hemisphere, you're more concerned that this could be setting a precedent, and therefore it wouldn't actually lessen the impact.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we've got to see what happens over the coming months and the coming years, and whether other countries will then follow Japan's lead. But the idea that you have whaling going on outside of the control or the influence of the International Whaling Commission is certainly very worrying. It is good that they've come out of the Southern Ocean, and many people are celebrating that.
And do you believe that this decision is more cultural or monetary? Like, help us understand why Japan argues it needs to do this.
I think there are all kinds of elements in Japan's case for whaling, and we've heard a lot about it. Since the global moratorium was agreed by the International Whaling Commission in the late 1980s, we've heard all kinds of arguments about this being cultural, about it being an enormous national issue, that they don't like people telling them what to do. I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that they are very dependent on marine resources, and so they don't want any lines to be drawn around any resources anywhere to stop them having access to them. I think that's a driving factor in this, but there are certainly other concerns as well.
Mark Simmons from the Humane Society International, thank you for joining us here on France 24. In a symbolic ceremony, the two Koreas celebrated the start of an ambitious joint rail project. But there's one big problem keeping the process from actually beginning. As long as U.S. and UN sanctions remain in place against North Korea, the materials needed for construction are banned. The project would modernize and reconnect rail and road links severed since the Korean War. However, Washington insists sanctions remain until the North gives up nuclear weapons. Next, an update on the delayed elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. 3 cities known as opposition strongholds will be excluded from the presidential vote on Sunday. People there will now vote in March. The Election Commission says this is due to an Ebola virus outbreak and ethnic violence, but activists are crying foul, and protests have been planned in one of the affected cities of Beni. For the latest on this story, let's cross now to France 24's Thomas Nicolin, who is in Kinshasa. Thomas, the Election Commission says this postponement is for security reasons. Can you elaborate more on why the Election Commission says this is necessary to hold this vote all the way in March?
Three cities won't be able to vote on the 30th of December. First of all, Beni and Butembo in eastern Congo. According to the Electoral Commission, Beni and Butembo can't vote First of all, because there's an Ebola outbreak since August 2018, and also because of the presence of armed groups in the area, armed groups like the Allied Democratic Forces that have been wreaking havoc for the past 2 years in eastern Congo. Now you also have the city of Yumbi in western Congo, where an ethnic conflict has killed more than 100 people last week. What's odd in this situation is that the Electoral Commission always said that the Ebola outbreak would never prevent the election from being held in eastern Congo. So why would they announce this delay only a few days before the poll? That's what a lot of people are wondering in Congo today.
So in March, for these people in these cities, are they still going to vote for president and it's just not going to count? How is that going to work?
This is what's unclear at the moment. The Electoral Commission says that these cities will vote for the presidential election in March 2019 and that their vote won't count. But you have 3 simultaneous elections on Sunday, on the 30th. You have the presidential election and the parliamentary elections, both national and local. So in March 2019, the people of Beni, Butembo and Yumbi will vote on the voting machines for the parliamentary elections, and the data that they will enter in the machine for the presidential election won't count because the new president will already be in power.
I imagine that is bound to inflame political tensions ahead of the vote. What's the reaction been to this postponement so far?
A few opposition leaders already reacted to this decision. One of them said that this decision by the Electoral Commission is illegal. Another one said that the whole country should vote for a presidential election, and that there is no way that these cities could be excluded from the process. But the most interesting reaction will be the reaction from the people, from the street. An election without Beni, Butembo and Yumbi is an election without more than 1 million people. More than 1 million Congolese people won't be able to take part in the most important democratic event in the history of this country. And it will be interesting to see if they accept the decision or if they organize marches, protests, and maybe this will all lead to another delay for this election. Maybe the Electoral Commission will have to postpone again. We will know more in the next couple of days.
Right, because this vote's supposed to mark the first democratic power transfer in the country, but I imagine if more than 1 million people are going to be excluded, that there will be many people upset about that. Thank you, Thomas, for that update, and we'll be following this story closely over the coming days. And finally, it was a record-breaking year for the Louvre Museum here in Paris. The world-famous art museum is set to welcome 10 million visitors in 2018. Our team reports on how the Louvre reached that number.
It's one of the most famous museums in the world, and the Louvre is on track to break its record with 10 million visitors in 2018. The final figures won't be confirmed until January. In the aftermath of the 2015 attacks, visitor numbers were in freefall. But the Louvre has since recovered, in part thanks to a refurbishment project. The foreign tourists are back.
I think more English as well. It's a little bit easier to get around. Some of the signage is different than it was in the last couple of years. It's just a little bit easier to find our way around, I think.
The Louvre wants to attract more locals. Only 29% of visitors in 2017 were French. They're put off by the museum's busy crowds and its size.
Seeing everything takes a lot of time.
But we had the day free and we thought, why not?
Even if we can't see everything, we could at least come and see some of the most famous paintings. I'm not from Paris. People don't talk about the Louvre that much.
To attract a younger and more local audience, the Louvre will offer free night visits on the first Saturday of each month, starting in January 2019.
That's all for this edition, but don't go away. There's more news and information coming up next here on France 24.
We live in a country without law or justice. So people get kidnapped, robbed, and they'd rather keep their mouths shut about it.
They don't go to the police because even the police officer they speak to could be an accomplice of the criminal who kidnapped them.
We live in a country where we don't know who's good and who's bad.
Don't miss Reporters Plus in Caracas, a stunning documentary on the reality of life in the Venezuelan capital, on France 24 and France24.com.